This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton, with your devotion taken from the book of Joshua, chapter 1, beginning with verse 10 and going through the end of the chapter. Joshua now is going to begin his leadership role as Moses has been taken into the promised land, and God has issued a command to Joshua to prepare the nation of Israel to cross over the Jordan and to go into the promised land. And Joshua showed his leadership skills that he had learned from Moses after being mentored for many years, in that he issued the command to his officials and he delegated the order to them to go and to deliver the message to the nation of Israel. As a result of that, we find that they go and they tell the nation of Israel, you have 3 days to prepare to go over to the promised land. In that 3 days, can you imagine what it must have been like? They had been waiting for 40 plus years for this moment, and now it had come. They had prepared for it. They had sent the spies out. They knew what they were going to get into, and now they were on the threshold of embarking upon a great journey to take the promised land. With that, though, was the mixed emotion that the fighting men were going to have to leave behind their wives, the women, the children, anything that meant anything to them, they were going to have to leave behind in order to go and to conquer this land. I would contrast that to people today that have to leave behind anything that means anything to them in order to go over and fight a conquest. The emotions that must have gone with that, and why it is that they were a people of faith. There's always that level of uncertainty, but yet that's where your trust in God comes from. We find that in verse 12, Joshua reminded them of the promise of the 2.5 tribes that were going to stay on this side of Jordan, that they had to fulfill their responsibility to help their brothers as they would go and they would conquer the promised land. And the brothers did not resist. That's the one thing that's interesting, is that they were reminded of the promise that they made, and in a moment that they could have balked, they didn't. Instead, they locked arms with their brothers and they got ready to cross over the Jordan, and then they were told that they could come back and reunite with their family, which is a sign of encouragement on the part of Joshua as well, that he instilled in his fighting men that they would be coming home to their families. That was a degree of confidence that Joshua had because he put his faith in God, and he knew that God had promised and that God would deliver on his promise. When you get to verse 16, the question is, how was Joshua's first test of leadership met? And when you read verse 16 through the end of the chapter, I want you to find or see 5 identifying qualities that showed how Joshua was recognized as a leader. First of all, the nation of Israel, the fighting men, said, wherever you command us to go, we will go. The second thing is that wherever you send us, we will respond. And the third thing is that there was a desire on their part for Joshua to be successful. They understood that as a nation, for them to be successful, Joshua had to be successful. And so they united behind him and they pressed forward in order to make him successful, because it was essential that he would be successful so that they could be successful. The fourth thing is that they said, we've got your back. In fact, it says anybody that does not follow the commandment, anybody that does not go where you send us, anyone who does not want to make you successful, Joshua, you don't worry about them. We'll take care of them ourselves. We find that the last thing is that they expected out of him what God expected out of him. And they identify those 2 qualifying marks in the last part of the chapter. They wanted him to be courageous, and they wanted him to be strong. They needed him to be courageous. They needed him to be strong, because if they were going to draw strength and if they were going to be courageous, they needed a leader out in front of them who had a leader out in front of him, and his name was God. And that strength and that courage passed down from God through Joshua to the fighting men and to the nation of Israel. And because of those 5 leadership qualities, they went forward and they conquered what God had given them in the way of the promised land.